Good afternoon. So thanks for joining ATR-AIP joint seminar on neuroscience-inspired artificial intelligence. My name is Motoaki Kawanabe, working both at ATR and Deriving AIP. So at ATR, we have started an ATR project on neuroscience of metacognition and brain-machine interface. The purpose of today's seminar is initiating communication between ATR and AIP on these research topics to accelerate these topics towards the future joint works. And we hope that we can collaborate with machine learning experts to accelerate computational neuroscience researches and to open up new directions of AI research together. So the first speaker is Dr. Aurelio Cortese. He is a deputy department head at ATR, a visiting researcher at the UCL, and in charge of computational neuroscience part of our project. And today, so he will talk about his neuroscience research on metacognition and introduce a computational framework of metacognition pursued in our project. And the second speaker, regarding the second speaker, so to train such complicated models as human learning, so continual lifelong learning is a key technique, we think. And the second speaker, Dr. Emtiyaz, the leader of Approximate Bayesian inference team, will introduce us the Bayesian learning rule focused on Bayesian learning rule focused a bit on lifelong learning and his recent achievements. And so before starting, I'd like to give some remark so for this seminars, so reproduction is prohibited, and reproduction or any part of the content is prohibited without the author's permission. And if you have any questions or comments, so please scroll to the bottom of the page and click the Q&A tab. And you can put questions or comments in the box. And this is the final remark. And please subscribe to our Deriving AIP YouTube channel and follow our Twitter. Okay, so this is some advertisement from Deriving AIP side. And so I'm very looking forward to the two talks today. And so Aurelio, so could you please start your talk?
I'm very happy to present our work on metacognition, on the neural correlates of metacognition and how it may, or we think it is implicated in learning. And how we may learn something from studying metacognition in humans. So this talk has a lot to do about decisions, how we make choices, but especially how we learn to make choices. So how we choose, how we learn that one choice is better than another, and because I think that this is really the sort of the central aspect of learning is choices. But making choices is not always easy. And I want to give you here a very quick sort of example. So suppose you are this hiker and you're in this forest and you want to go back to your tent. Now, this environment is relatively high. One could say is quite complex and is relatively high dimensional. So this means that there is information in this environment that is relevant for your goal to go back to your tent, and some information that is just not relevant, that you don't really need to consider. And so the idea here is that if this agent sort of crosses this little bridge and then walks through the forest to get the tent and takes as input all this sensory information from this forest, this will be quite complicated to compute a behavioral trajectory. Now, on the other hand, if this agent is able to create an abstraction, to create a sort of summarized representation for how sort of this path has to if you follow us, to go through this forest, can be very advantageous, because working on the lower dimensional space, on this kind of abstractions, is probably what allows us humans and animals or other animals to learn and to learn efficiently, instead of sort of getting lost into too many small details. Now I'm highlighting this at the beginning because a lot of learning we explaining through the reinforcement learning. And it is not clear how an agent can go from this high dimensional sensory space to this abstract representation space. And I think this conversion is very important, and is also where metacognition probably plays a role. And so learning, usually we explain it, at least in experiments, but also in general for animals or any kind of biological agent or artificial agents. We can explain it through reinforcement learning. So this framework in which we have an agent that is in the world and can make some observations about the outer world. They will have some internal state, and then they can take some action in this world. And based on their actions and what is the current state of the world, they would receive some feedback. They would get some outcome. It could be reward, it could be a punishment, nothing at all. Now, this is a very powerful framework that does explain a lot of let's say aspect of human behavior and other animals, especially how we learn. Now, it is also true that in its let's say standard implementation, reinforcement learning suffer from what we call the curse of dimensionality. So when, in general, this happens when the data is sparse, dimensions are very large, but training is limited. Sort of that it becomes almost impossible to find any solution to a learning problem. The humans seem to be very, very good at solving this kind of problems. And so how might the brain sort of implement solutions to this current to this problem of curse of dimensionality? So there's a few sort of hypotheses or ideas. This can go from a sparseness prior, so the brain might have already a prior that on the data is sparse, and on which of the dimensions might be just biologically or evolutionarily relevant. If the brain is building internal models, this can be built at some point, but then reapplied later on, so that data usage can be more efficient. There is modularity, so we don't have a single huge module, but the brain is most likely a collection of different modules, each one treating a sub-problem. You can see this is a sort of divide and conquer strategy that, when it's paired with a sort of hierarchical structure, then can make a reinforcement learning and learning already more efficient. But the sort of the core topic of my talk today is this aspect about higher cognitive function, and more specifically metacognition, which I will explain now in a couple of slides, what I actually mean by metacognition and what is it. But basically, yes, I think, and probably others as well, we think that these higher cognitive functions are really a key aspect in how humans are able to learn very complex problems, but usually in a data efficient manner, so without needing millions of training samples. And I think as an aside to this, it also allows humans and animals and other animals to have good generalization ability. So once we learn a problem and we solve it, we are relatively good at reapplying the same sort of internal model to a different situation, but it might be related in some ways. So in our first study, so we wanted to really try to understand better how is metacognition related or involved in learning, and especially learning of this complex problem that requires huge dimensionality reduction process. So of course, first of all, is how can the brain learn low dimensional representations for optimal choices? And the key question is whether does metacognition facilitate learning in this kind of situation, in this context. So metacognition in itself, because I would like to give a definition first, we can describe it as a sort of, from a psychology viewpoint, as a self-monitoring. So it's as a sort of, you can say, is monitoring our own performance or our own perception or thinking about our own thought processes, our own actions, own behaviors. So this is still quite broad, but usually we measure in the lab or in our human experiments, we measure metacognition as confidence. So we measure metacognition as the confidence in one choice. And there's several previous studies that have shown how this is, it's important for behavior. So confidence is a feeling of confidence that we have in our choices can guide behavior, and especially can guide future choices. So for example, if you make a choice and you're not confident, the next time that we are presented with the same options, you might be more likely to switch your choice, to switch your preference, just because you were not confident, and so you don't have, maybe you don't have you will not have a strong commitment to a certain choice. Brown et al., philosopher, have also, they are philosophers, and they published these papers a couple of years ago, and they essentially posited that metacognition might be relevant to guide behavior, also because metacognition might be related to what they call here meta-representations. So representations that are re-representations of an ongoing sensory or motor information. So you might see that sensory areas are representing, for example, visual cortex is representing the information about the screen. But when we are reasoning about this information, then we would have what they call here a meta-representation. So this could be a sort of abstracted lower dimensional representation of this ongoing sensory information. And metacognition would be playing this would be part of this transformation mechanism. So to study how metacognition is involved in, especially if it plays any kind of strong role in learning complex structures, and especially in learning tasks that require strong dimensionality reduction, we thought about the following sort of experimental design. So if we take the human brain and we focus on any of these brain areas, there's billions of neurons. And even if we measure this area with fMRI, so with functional magnetic resonance imaging, we don't measure every single neuron, we just have voxels, so the equivalent of a pixel in 3D. But even with that, yes, if someone has a question already at this point, I'm happy to stop, or yeah, maybe like if there is if the question, I think then maybe they can write it in the Q&A box, and then I can take it from there later. Okay, so let me continue, I think, in the interest of time. So we decided to design a task, as I said here, even if we measure brain activity with functional magnetic resonance imaging, even for a specific given area, we would measure lots of patterns, like countless different activity patterns. Now, if we have a decoder, what we can do is that we can sort of divide those activity patterns into two classes. And so once we've trained a decoder and we've established this this decoder boundary, we can take any new activity pattern and sort of let it fall into, which would fall into one of the two classes. And this gives us, I think, a sort of very nice framework to build a task on this. The reason is we can measure very high dimensional activity patterns, but we can transform this with this decoding approach into a sort of behavior task that participant can do and try to solve. So basically, we had 18 participants who were in the fMRI scanner and did 3+1 sessions. So the +1 is the initial session to actually train a decoder, and the 3 sessions were the learning sessions. So we constructed a decoder in either in the visual cortex or in the prefrontal cortex, and participants what they saw in the task was a very noisy random dot motion stimulus. Actually, in the first two sessions, the stimulus was pure noise. So there was no sensory information in that. They were asked to judge a motion of left or right, to give a confidence rating on their choice, and then to choose between two options, A or B. If they made the correct bet, so if they chose, let's say, A, and A was the correct option on that trial, they would receive a reward. And otherwise, they would receive an error signal. So what is important here is that the decoder was trained on this initial session on actual motion signals. So the decoder, what was doing during the task was reading out those activity patterns in one of those two brain areas and was sort of transforming this high-dimensional information into a two-dimensional, so one-dimensional with two options, contextual information for the task. So what participants did not know this association. What they knew, what we told them is that the stimulus would be very, very noisy, and so it would be very difficult. They would have to try to give this to make this perceptual choice, to rate their confidence, and then to learn when they should bet on A or the B option. On the third session, we actually translated the decoder output, the decoder information, into an actual stimulus motion. So we could also test if participants could explicitly learn the association rule. So in this case, that let's say a right motion corresponds to a B optimal choice, and a left motion corresponds to an A optimal choice. So essentially what this means is that we do an online decoding of these activity patterns in the brain. The decoder will output a class, which we can call right or left, or depending on the motion that is represented in this ongoing fluctuating brain activity. And we have a trial sequence. For every participant, there is a clear mapping that if the decoder output is right, then the optimal action is A, so it's the A option that will lead to reward. If the decoder output is left, then the optimal action that the participant should choose to get a reward is B. As I said, participants are not aware of this mapping. So this is a very complex problem, because sort of the brain has to figure out sort of what is its current state in order to choose the correct option to get a reward. And so we looked at this over those three sessions that participants did, and we considered that the first sessions, mostly participants were roughly were around chance, so they're not really able to make the correct bet. So here you can see this is the session one. Each dot is a participant sort of averaged probability of choosing the optimal action now for all participants with all decoders together. Now, when we looked on the second session, so now we've participants have reached a few hundreds of these trial and errors. Now we see that overall this ability to choose the correct action as a slight improvement, and at the group level this becomes better than chance. On the third session, now this becomes very high, and this is due to multiple reasons. One is that the associations become actually explicit. All participants but one, at the end of the experiment, they could report the correct association between a motion representation and action selection. So for example, right with B and left with A. So this already showed us that participants were able to learn this task, although it was an extremely complex task. But then we thought, okay, our hypothesis here is that metacognition is involved in this learning process. So if we can measure, if we can get a measure of metacognitive ability, maybe we can predict how well participants will be able to learn during those first two sessions, which are the actual sort of difficult test sessions. So we computed meta D prime. So meta D prime is a signal detection theoretic measure of how well confidence ratings they track the accuracy of a choice. Session 0, this is so this meta D prime was computed with the session that we used only to train the decoder. So this is a very standard perceptual task and not the actual learning task. But we can see that participants who have better meta D prime are actually able over those first two sessions to achieve higher baseline action selection accuracy. So those who have better metacognitive introspection, they're able to better learn this task. So this is the first sort of level of evidence for the possible role of metacognition in this efficient learning. We next modeled behavior of participants with reinforcement learning, and we computed so for every trial what we call the prediction error. So the model would sort of give us an indication of how much surprise participants might have between what they predicted to receive as an outcome and what they actually received. So this prediction error is essentially an indication of how large is the mismatch between the expectation given the current trial, the current stimulus, or the current brain state representation, and the actual outcome that was received after the action selection. And we plotted those, actually not the prediction error in itself, but the magnitude. So the magnitude is a sort of indication of how much uncertainty there is in the learning. So the higher this value, the more uncertainty, because the larger the mismatch between predicted and occurred. And we decided to plot those prediction errors on a trial-by-trial basis, but divided by confidence level. And so we see that on the first session, there seems to be some sort of relationship between the two, but it is not significant, it is not strong. It's also because on the first session, participants tend to be overall also not very confident. Now in the second session, now we start to see that this relationship becomes stronger. So now we start to see that when participants are not confident, so one is very low confidence, and means when participants give this rating, they're essentially choosing at random. This is the instruction that we give them. We see that on average, across trial, there is a higher magnitude of prediction errors. On trials instead in which participants are more confident, now this magnitude of prediction error is lower. So we start to have sort of a link now on the computational level between this sort of psychological construct of confidence metacognition and the learning behavior itself. So this prediction errors. And on the third session now, we see a very strong effect of this association between confidence with this prediction error magnitude. So that the two across learning are actually linked. The fact that we see metacognition and learning are sort of they seem to be linked at the behavior level. Now here it's at the mix of behavior and computational level, sort of prompted us to think, okay, there should be a neural correlate for this interaction between the two. And because the task was done in the fMRI scanner, we have access to approximation of neural activity data. And so we reasoned that perhaps the two regions in the brain that are generally found to encode confidence, so this is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia, which is implicated in reinforcement learning. We thought that those two areas might become more connected or coupled as participants learn this task. So the way that we went about to test this coupling is that we built a decoder for high versus low confidence in the prefrontal cortex, in the DLPFC. And we constructed a decoder for basal ganglia. So in the basal ganglia for high versus low magnitude of prediction error. So here we have, this is a continuous variable, this is ordinate variable. We simply, for the decoding, we simply transformed each of these into categorical variables. And we then trained these decoders on each session. And we looked at on the test data at how the prediction of the decoders, they associated, they paired. So if there is any coupling between those two areas that happen with learning, we would expect that a prediction of high confidence from the decoder in the prefrontal cortex should map with a prediction of low magnitude of prediction error from the decoder in the basal ganglia. Now, in the first session, this was not significant, was just extremely weak. But from the second session, we find a significant association of this decoder prediction. Sort of what this means is that there are learning-driven, basically, changes in the neural coupling of those two areas. And this gives us a neural substrate for how maybe metacognition and reinforcement learning might interact together during learning, and especially to accelerate learning. So to summarize this first study, we found that we can use non-conscious brain state to determine a hidden task condition. So participants are not aware of the association between the on-brain states and the optimal actions. These conditions are implicit, and participants have to learn them. This means that the brain of participants have to solve a complex, very high-dimensional decision problem. They seem to be able to do so. And metacognition is probably related to the reinforcement learning processes at the behavior, computational, and neural level. And our idea here is that metacognition is really important for this learning. So metacognition is what enables this learning of very complex high-dimensional states to take place. But with this study, we have no, we essentially have only indirect evidence. So this will be actually our future work. Now, in the next study, so as I mentioned originally at the beginning, we have there are several potential ways that the brain might reduce the dimensionality of the task space or of the neural representation space. I talked about metacognition and in a way also related to consciousness, but there are several other cognitive functions that we think are involved. And I will now focus on abstractions, also because abstractions are, I really believe abstractions are intimately linked to this idea of metacognition and meta-representations, because in all cases, abstraction should be sort of simplified, summarized representation of ongoing either task information or sensory information. And abstraction, therefore, should be related to learning. And this is, one could say, could be kind of obvious, that if an agent is using abstraction, they should be learning faster. So we did again an experiment with humans. We scanned them with the fMRI to obtain brain activity data, and the task was a relatively simple compared to the previous one task, in which participants were presented with these Pac-Man style visual stimuli that were composed of you can see 3 different visual features. You have the color, the orientation of the stripes, and the side or the direction of the mouth, which could be right or left. Orientation could be horizontal or vertical. Color could be red or green. And those Pac-Mans, those stimuli were associated with a preference for a given fruit. So participants on every block of this experiments had to learn those preference associations. So those were governed by underlying rules that were implicit, were latent. Participants did not know them a priori, but they had to learn them through trial and error. On every block, only 2 features were relevant to the preference, and 1 feature was always irrelevant. So you can already see that with this visual stimuli, there is information that has to be focused upon, and information that has to be that the agent has to ignore, that is irrelevant. There were 2 types of associations. On the left side here, this was what we can call a symmetric association, where we have the color and the orientation in this example. So if it is green and vertical, then it's orange. green and horizontal is grape. Thus the opposite. So instead of green is red and horizontal vertical is grape, and then again orange. Now we decided to introduce also what we call this asymmetric pairing, because some participants who might be particularly good, but they might just use logical inference if they learn one of these association to deduce all the others. And this was not really what we wanted to have. We wanted them to sort of to learn through experience. And when there are those two types of associations, then sort of learning one of them, sort of learning one of this pairing does not guarantee immediately that we would know all the three others. And so these pairings were assigned at random at the beginning of each block. Participants had to learn them to trial and error. They could see the feedback after each choice, whether it was correct or not. And they were incentivized with a reward that was commensurate to their performance in the task at the end of the experiment. So we see that participants were able to learn this task pretty well. I'm going to give you a couple of behavioral accounts of learning. Here, this is a sort of within block view. On the x-axis, you have the trials. So this is trials as they happen within averaged across blocks. And on the y-axis, you have essentially the ratio correct, the probability of making a correct choice. So the first trial obviously should be a chance, because the rule is a new rule is determined randomly at the beginning of a block, and participants don't know it. But we see that very quickly from the second trial onwards, we have, although it is a relatively low performance, it goes up relatively quickly, and it is already significantly different from chance from the trial number 2. We see also that so over the whole experiment, participants become better at learning the rules. So here you have the learning speed is essentially an inverse of how long it takes a participant to learn the rule within one block. The way we measure whether a participant had learned or not the rule was by calculating a number of sequential correct trials. So if participants sequentially report correctly the fruit, then for more between 8 and 12 trials, then this is deemed a learned rule. And so we can calculate how many trials it took them to learn. And with that, the inverse of this essentially is the learning speed. So we see that participants across time as they do more blocks in the task, their performance gradually increases. So they become better at solving this, at learning the rules. Importantly, we find that when we ask them at the end of the experiment how confident they are to make this metacognitive judgment on their performance, we see that those participants who are overall more confident about how they did the task, those are also the participants who were able to display higher learning speed. They were faster at learning the rules across the whole experiment. So we have already again this sort of association between confidence and learning ability. But we might already think that there are more than one behavior strategy to solve this kind of task. So some information is relevant, some information is irrelevant. So here too, we used reinforcement learning simply to model this, how participant choices progress through the task and maybe improved with learning. So with this very simple Q learning, there are a couple of important parameters or aspects to this equation. And one that I really want to focus on is the state at the current trial. So this is the Q value, is the expected sort of return for a given association between a visual stimulus and the rule. Action is the action that the participant choose, a learning rate, and the stochasticity, how random our participant choices are. But what is important here is that in this task, we can define the state at the current trial in different ways. So if we look at all the possible pairings of the three features that make up the visual stimulus. And the way that those features are associated with the fruit preference of the Pac-Mans, of the stimuli, there's essentially two ways that those can be looked at. The first one here on the left is what I call feature array. So this is a very inefficient way because it is redundant. But here it takes, so this approach here essentially tracks every possible combinations of the three features, regardless of whether they're relevant or not for the current rule. Because each one is a unique combination, they will still be associated with a given fruit, and therefore the agent can learn the correct action. So which fruit to choose on for every association. Now the right side is what I call here abstract array. This is essentially again like a summarized version of this more complex or higher dimensional space, but that considers only the relevant features. Now, if an agent is able to use the correct abstraction, now this agent is going to be more efficient because the space is for the task is reduced. So if we test, of course, if we do simulations and we run agents to solve this task, we can see that the agents that use this abstract RL strategies are going to be faster at solving the task overall. And an agent that uses a feature RL strategy, because it is redundant, will be and there's more states to explore, will be slower. Now, this is simply sort of a confirmation from the model part. But when we look at the participant behavior data, we find, I think, here this very interesting and very nice correlation. So we see that participants who are more likely to use an abstract, so this abstract RL strategy across blocks, are also those that overall learn faster. And confidence again is related to this ability to use this abstraction. So the more at the end of the experiment, the participants who had like during the experiment had used more used abstractions, they also were more confident about the performance at the end of the whole study. So this tells us, okay, that participants seem to use, they probably use actually both type of strategies. When we compute this abstraction index is a sort of average measure across all the blocks. But given our initial result that participant performance improves across the task, we might expect that some trials, so this is again, that on some trials, participants, especially at the beginning of the experiment, they would be more likely to use a feature strategy and later on an abstract strategy. This plot here is simply to show that the mapping between across all participants, all data, the mapping between the learning speed and the probability of using an abstract or feature strategy. So low learning speed translate as using a feature strategy, high learning speed to use an abstract strategy. But I think what is important is we see that across the experiment, there is a switch in strategy. So participants shift from an initial more feature-based strategy to a more abstract. Here is just looking, this is just the number of participants on the first and on the last block, which one is the strategy that best fit the behavior data. And we have this sort of this switching in behavior. But also if we look at if we do a median split of the block for each participant and we divide them therefore into early and late blocks in the experiment, we see that early on abstraction level is lower and later on abstraction level is higher. Abstraction level simply means is the propensity of using the abstract strategy. So we have this shift in behavior. And it seems to be related to confidence because participants were more confident at the end are also more likely to have used an abstract strategy. But what happens in the brain when the stimulus is viewed? So this is before the decision. This is the time when this sort of abstract representation should be created in the brain itself, because the visual information is identical in all identical in the sense in all trials, regardless of whether participants use a feature or an abstract strategy. That is only their internal representation. So for that, first of all, we wanted to confirm that that if we use a model-based approach, so if we look at the predicted value in every trial, that we can confirm that we will find the same brain area that is usually found in value-based choices that is also active in this task, because this would give a sort of confirmation that participants are solving this task using also valuation. So for that, we used a simple GLM, so general linear model analysis. It's basically a correlation between brain activity patterns and this trial by trial measure of expected value. And what we find this sort of increased activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So here, when we do a contrast between high and low value on trials in which participants have a higher value expectation, this area is more active. And this is important because we are going to use this area for further analysis, because this tells us that when participants view the Pacman, this is the area that is probably computing a value signal that might be used for learning. But as I meant, so as I just said now, at the time of viewing the character, the VMPFC activity encodes value. But this value, again, has to be constructed based on the visual information, because the task is about visual stimuli. So it must be based on the task visual information. And for that, one appropriate approach is to use what we call a psychophysiological interaction. We compute a connectivity analysis across the whole brain based on a seed area. So we used as a seed the VMPFC, this blob of active voxels in the VMPFC, and we look for activity across the brain that is modulated by this high versus low value, and how this is coupled with the VMPFC activity itself. And I think this is a sort of nice confirmation that that there is a sort of potential communication between the VMPFC who is building these value signals, and the visual cortex was sort of the entry point for the sensory information in this task. So you can see here, these are the voxels which show sort of significant functional coupling with the VMPFC activity cluster that I showed you earlier. Now the strength of this coupling is also behaviorally relevant, because those participants who have a stronger coupling are also those that overall are better at learning the task. Sort of as to say that those participants who have sort of better communication or are better able to transmit this sensory information from visual cortex to the VMPFC, also those who are better able to learn the task faster. But as I said earlier, participants use both a feature-specific and an abstract strategy. So they did not use only one or the other. So what we thought here is that maybe the VMPFC itself is sensitive to the strategy that is being used. This would fit well with the idea that that those value signals are not just built as they are, but they are really relevant for the behavior, and in this case for the strategy that is being used. We also compared with the hippocampus, because a lot of previous studies have shown that the hippocampus is implicated in abstractions and conceptual knowledge. But in a way, to our surprise, we found that only the VMPFC was significantly modulated by the use of an abstract strategy. Again, this VMPFC area is the same cluster of voxels that we find active about value. So we can see that the same area is both important for value and for abstraction, and that there is a strong interaction between the two. So to give you a quick summary on this point, abstraction correlates with the learning speed. We have a coupling between the VMPFC and the visual cortex that predicts the learning speed. This is related to in a previous study showing that value capture sensory processing by an attention mechanism. We find that the VMPFC activity is prioritized under abstraction, and that value perhaps therefore biases attention towards certain features for abstraction. There is work in rodents that has shown that lateral OFC neurons can instruct sensory cortex through value, but in humans, we don't really have such evidence. So we thought maybe we can do this artificially. We can add value artificially to one of the features through decoded neurofeedback. So with this technique, we use online decoding or monitoring of activity patterns in an area, and we train participants through reward to associate these activity patterns with a reward. So participants are not aware of this association, but what happens is that the brain over time learns that a target activity patterns means reward. And so with that, we can then directly test in our experiment here if we give exogenous value, we associate a exogenous value to a feature, does this lead to more abstraction? So to prioritize abstraction. So participants did, after this neurofeedback training, they did the same behavioral task. And when we compared their abstraction level before, so this is the late part of the main experiment, and then we compare on two types of blocks. So when the features that was reinforced was relevant or irrelevant, we find a relatively strong dissociation, in the sense that on trials in which the feature that was associated with value, those block participants were more likely to use abstract strategy, and in blocks in which the feature was irrelevant, the abstraction level was lower. So that sort of in support to the hypothesis that abstraction is sort of driven by value, and the way that it does so is value probably captures the attention. So abstraction correlates with the learning speed. As I said, we have this coupling between the VMPFC and visual cortex, sensory areas, that predicts the learning. This might point to the fact that maybe the brain is continuously reproducing or recreating task state, task information that can account for new information. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex area that is responsible for value construction is prioritized under abstraction. So there is a link between abstraction and value. And the way that it might do so is that value could control attention towards the features that then need to be integrated for abstraction. And so perhaps this is a kind of like a tagging sensory mechanism. And so with this, we have that the value signals sort of tell what to abstract from. This is implemented maybe in the VMPFC, and it's consistent with previous work that has shown that this area represents hidden task states. So hidden task states are also a form of are an abstraction in the end, because they're not sensorially, they're not presented as such to the participant. But the VMPFC also is one of the computation it does is it tracks the reliability of a current strategy. And perhaps, and I think this brings me back to the idea of metacognition, which I will go just after, is that the part of the prefrontal cortex networks is involved in calculating some reliability about behavior, about a strategy, about representation. And another part of the prefrontal cortex, maybe the dorsolateral, is a form of controller. And there is actually some scanned evidence in monkey research that sort of confidence could be part of this cognitive controller of strategies. Let me go further. The reason I'm talking about this is because metacognition to me is related to these meta-representations. And meta-representations are low dimensional. So when I say here that metacognition may be part of a controller for behavioral strategies, this is due to the fact that metacognition might be involved, might create those low dimensional representations, those meta-representations. And this is a discussion that we started to have here at ATR, especially with Mitsuo Kawato, on how to sort of bring all this under a more like a sort of unifying explanation instead of having like different pieces of information, and to sort of have a framework that can explain in a more computationally driven manner what is and how is metacognition computed. So as I mentioned earlier, the brain is an hierarchical structure, is modular, and works a lot also with different type of predictions. So the way that we formulated this framework, so here is essentially a depiction. To create a strong parallel with this idea of metacognition and controller and previous sort of theories both by Hakon Lau and Sam Gershman on the function of the prefrontal cortex in determining both consciousness as well as high-level behavior, is that we posit that there is a what we call a cognitive reality monitoring network. This is sort of roughly maps on the prefrontal cortex. Now this is sort of sits, you could say, on top as the highest layer of this big hierarchical structure that is composed on many different types of modules. So you have an hierarchical structure, you have modularity, and you have a lot of parallel computation loops that connect maybe sensory area, motor area with the basal ganglia and with the prefrontal cortex. Now, the reason for having this structure, and it's important for metacognition, is because this prefrontal cognitive reality monitoring network, its role is to select what is the relevant information, what is the appropriate neural representation now. And it has to do so at a certain level of abstraction. So those sensory and motor hierarchies work at different levels of abstraction. And each one of these is looped with the basal ganglia, so that prediction errors can be computed about a given representation. Those are also linked across themselves and with the input flow from both sensory or motor systems to compute prediction, not reward, but just sensory or motor prediction errors on the mismatch between a sort of internal representation and the outer representation. The way that this mismatch is computed, if you can see here on this hierarchy, you see that each module is formed by a sort of coupled conjugate models. One is a forward generative model. The other one is an inverse model. The generative model essentially is trying to predict what is the outer information, and the inverse model is simply sort of relaying in a fast feed-forward manner, for example, in the sensory cortex, the sensory information. Now, those two conjugate models have a mismatch on some circumstances. For example, if the generative model is focused on different information compared to what is actually presented, or if there is no information presented, this mismatch is relayed then to this prefrontal cognitive reality monitoring. So this relay of all these different types of errors, from prediction errors, motor command errors, sensory prediction errors, are used to compute what is indicated here with a lambda, a responsibility signal. This, I think, is a key feature of this framework, is that this responsibility signal is used by the CRM network to select, to gate what is the most relevant, the most appropriate neural representation, then can guide behavior. And this responsibility signal, of course, is based is at the highest level of this hierarchy, and is also at the lowest level of dimensionality. So it's a relatively sparse and very compact representation, which kind of like roughly maps this inverted hourglass model. So we go from high dimensional sensory representation to very low compact prefrontal representation. And this responsibility signal maps on these very compact representations and is directly related to metacognition or consciousness, in the sense that if the agent is conscious about a specific item or sensory information, then this will be because the responsibility signal for the representation is very high, and the responsibility signal for all other representation is low. So the entropy overall will be so we will have low entropy in that sense. Now we have, of course, if there is no consciousness, then all the responsibility signal should be low, and thus using this responsibility signal, sorry, lambda by k, we can determine what is when the brain or when the system would be conscious or unconscious, and about what. But it also tell us whether we expect to see a sort of metacognition or not, because if we have this responsibility signal for a given model that is high, then we expect to have high metacognitive insight for that representation. So you can see that metacognition is related about a specific module, is not necessarily about the overall, like all the possible representations, while confidence in that sense is more global, is across all the representation across the whole brain. Which ones have high responsibility? Those are the ones that are going to enter the conscious sphere. So this is a very complex model overall, but the way that we are sort of starting to work toward it is using a mixture of expert reinforcement learning architecture, which roughly maps with this idea of having different modules. We have a sort of an hierarchy across modules, and we have a gating, either gating function or it could be a gating network that then will, based on this, on different responsibility signals, will select the most appropriate representation to guide actions. So for this, we'll run simulations, and we will use the data from our paper on abstractions, because this can be modeled with different types of these internal representations. And so with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention in this maybe too long presentation.
Aurelio, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. And so now it's time for maybe the discussion. Maybe we may have 3-4 minutes for discussion. So, are there any questions or comments from the audience or also the panelists?
I can ask a question.
Yeah,
please.
Okay, well, I'll be quick because there's another question that came up here. I don't know if you can see me anymore.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so great talk, thank you. And I had a question the whole talk. I was thinking about this, and in the end you started answering the question, so that was great. But I would again say it, so it seems like you're saying, so abstraction and confidence, seems like they are related somehow, and you're saying that abstraction is more low level and confidence is more like higher level. Am I right in thinking that?
Yes. So the way that I'm seeing this is the two are sort of related, but I see abstraction as having sort of a whole hierarchy of levels. So there are many possible levels of abstraction. While confidence, I think it is really at the top level. Now, the way that confidence or metacognition overall related to abstraction is that so if metacognition is so if an agent has some metacognitive insight about a representation or about a I don't know, whatever information that is currently represented, then this will sort of automatically trigger a re-representation. And so this is how, so it does not necessarily mean that confidence in itself generates the abstraction, but confidence is sort of, you could say that maybe confidence is calling or the abstraction mechanism. So if we have this confidence feeling or this metacognitive insight about representation, sort of this automatically starts the abstraction process and generate and which will then generate an abstract representation. Does it make sense, or is it a bit? I don't
know. No. I mean, that was like kind of my second question, and that I'm thinking about what comes first, you know. And I mean, of course, maybe that's the wrong question. They're all there doing different things, but yeah, but
yeah. So I think the sort of which come first is a good question, or at least in terms of the directionality. So which one has a stronger impact on which? And I think it might be actually sort of a recursive process. So once you start building this confidence feeling, once this kind of confidence is starting to build, this will of course draw on some sensory or motor representation, and by doing so, this will sort of start bringing this relevant aspect of the sensory representation into a higher, more abstract representation. But this in itself might have, an impact on the confidence itself. And I think at this stage it's difficult for me to say which comes first.
Yeah, I mean, it's sorry, I'll finish and let you answer all the questions. But I mean, I'm thinking about this, and maybe we can discuss about this a little bit later. Is people talking about like, what's the goal? What's the purpose? Is it to create abstractions, or is it to like make decisions or predict the world? And I think these things are kind of connected in that sense, is that it's not clear, one is related to abstraction, the other one is related to confidence. So yeah, let's discuss maybe later, and I'll let you answer the other question.
Thank you.
So thank you, Emti. And probably so we have one question, but maybe due to the sake of time, Aurelio, could you answer this offline?
I will type my answer. I will stop sharing, and I will type the answer there. Yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot for inviting me and organizing all this. This is wonderful. Looking forward to discussion. So I tried to change the title a little bit and add a few components of, it's kind of adaptive, lifelong, robust learning with the Bayesian learning rule. And there's a lot of material to cover, but I will see if there's not enough time, I might skip some of it. So my name is Mohammed Emtiyaz Khan, but just call me MT. And the slides of this talk, you can find it on my webpage, so you can see it there. And also thanks to some of my colleagues who has actually helped me to prepare this talk. An earlier version was given at a NeurIPS Bayesian Deep Learning workshop in December. Okay, so let me start with the main goal. So one of the main goals of machine learning, I hope we can all agree, is to design AI systems that can learn as quickly as we do. That is, learn by quickly adapting to the new situation that arise in the future, while robustly preserving and exploiting the past knowledge. So a learning machine and an algorithm that you design, it must balance the past and the future knowledge, and it should keep learning continuously, slowly collecting knowledge over time. But this kind of balance of between past and future, it's a delicate balance. It's difficult to attain in practice. So sometimes a system that is too keen on new information can fail catastrophically. So this is an example of Microsoft's chatbot Tweet, which went crazy after being deployed, in 2016. Just after 24 hours of being deployed, it started to learn from other people's tweet, and it just adapted very quickly and start to say, become a Twitter troll, essentially, trusting new information much more than the old one that it was trained on. So it was overfitting. But the opposite can also be true, that if you're too rigid, too robustly remember the old knowledge, you may fail to recognize the changes in your surroundings. So like in robotics, the systems are too rigid and they're not flexible. So in general, kind of designing systems that can both be robust and adaptive is a challenging task. And this is the kind of the main topic of the talk. So the goal here is to argue that the good algorithm, the ones that work in practice, they somehow balance the robustness and adaptivity. The argument in this talk is that they always have a Bayesian side to them. So this is kind of the hypothesis that's being put. Whether the algorithms are Bayesian or non-Bayesian, it doesn't matter. We can sort of see them as approximating a Bayesian objective, a Bayesian posterior distribution. So I'll try to talk about this first in the context of this new Bayesian algorithm, which I call the Bayesian learning rule. It's a general purpose learning rule, where we are kind of approximating the posterior distribution by an appropriate approximation. So we have flexibility to choose it. And when we choose it, we end up kind of deriving different types of learning algorithms that work well in practice. So it unifies and generalizes many existing algorithms that are found to work well in practice. Then we'll use this Bayesian learning rule to go into robustness. So it gives us a new way to see robustness by using posterior approximations. And I will talk about identification of this representation, the memory, something that we call memorable examples, memorable experiences of a learning machine. This again generalizes many existing concepts of such memory in both Bayesian and non-Bayesian worlds. So it's kind of the same message here, that you can use the Bayesian perspective to understand robustness of a learning algorithm by using this kind of memorable representation. And then finally, in the end, very quickly, I'll go through how you can use these kind of representations, memorable examples for adaptation in continuum learning. And we'll find that all sorts of adaptive systems in machine learning, they all use the same kind of prior, which we call knowledge adaptation prior, or K priors. And so the takeaway of this talk is really to show that there's a modern perspective of Bayes that we believe is essential for adaptive and robust deep learning. And we'll show it through kind of 3 lines of work. So the papers here at the bottom are the ones that are already out. So most of 4 of them are out. One is still in preparation. So I encourage you to have a look at these papers from our group. The slides are online, so you can actually go and check those out on my website. Okay, feel free to ask questions in between. So let's start with the first part. So the question of like what makes an algorithm good and what are some common origins of good learning algorithms. And I draw an analogy here to the origin of species and natural selection, because the question is very similar. So origin of species is about natural algorithms, and here we are concerned with artificial ones. And it is clear that good algorithm, whether natural or artificial, it must kind of revise its past belief by extracting new information, useful information from the new data. And it's kind of hard to know what is new, and that's why we need a clear objective to be able to define what is new and what is old, and to be able to then balance this information. So we expect that this kind of property should be true of all algorithms that are derived through, hacks or empirical experimentation, like what we do in deep learning. Some of them, if they are found well to work in practice, then they should be somehow balancing the new and old information. And it is possible that all of such good algorithms have a common origin, they optimize similar objective, and they use similar strategies on how the optimization proceeds. So in our recent work, we argue for a Bayesian origin. And again, this is a hypothesis that's been kind of verified by the work. So the origin is Bayesian, where good algorithms, they optimize for a Bayesian objective that is shown on the right here, as opposed to a non-Bayesian objective, which is shown on the left. So often the deep learning algorithms are just minimizing a loss with respect to parameter, but we're saying that good algorithms should always kind of optimize a Bayesian objective, where instead of finding just a parameter on one model, we're finding a distribution over models. So distribution over model parameter. And this Bayesian objective is essentially the elbow or the free energy used in approximate inference to estimate a posterior approximation. So this Q is the posterior approximation. It's just sort of written in a slightly different form than in the standard Bayes rule or in the variational inference. It's written with KL regularization, but we've written this with entropy here. So I'm going to assume that this Q is an exponential family form. So then the hypothesis is that a wide variety of algorithms can be derived from this specific algorithm that I call the Bayesian learning rule. The algorithm, I mean, there's lots of details here and there in these papers, but the thing to remember is that suppose this Q is exponential family distribution, then lambda denote the natural parameter of that exponential family. And if you don't remember what a natural parameter is, it's okay. Just think of like some type of mean and covariance of a Gaussian. So these are those parameters, and then you're updating the parameters by combining the old natural parameter and computing this gradient. And this gradient is taken with respect to a dual parameter, which is called expectation parameters. So for a Gaussian, you can think of it as mean and the correlation. And you can think of lambda as something derived from mean and the covariance. And mu is like moments, expectations. So mean and correlation. Okay, so don't have to worry about the details if you don't follow, just kind of think of two alternate parameterization as the same thing. And now you're saying that your old belief is somehow incorporated with the natural parameter of the distribution, and the new belief comes through this gradient that you compute. And these gradients are actually natural gradients because they're computed with respect to mu. And if you don't know what that is also fine, but it's a sort of a special type of gradient where the gradient is scaled with the Fisher information matrix. So somehow adjusting to the geometry of the distribution. So the idea here is then to say that this natural gradient is kind of the new information. It's kind of innovation, something that we have not extracted yet in lambda. And now at this time, you look at this gradient, and then you add it to the new lambda. You get the new lambda, and then you compute the new mu, and then you compute the innovation, this new information again. So that's the kind of point that this gradient is essential, is the main basic quantity, and this gradient is kind of computed with respect to the distribution. It's not the gradient of the loss directly. So the distribution is sort of a lens that helps you to then mine relevant information, new information that you define through the distribution, what is new and what is old. Okay. There's a lot of kind of insights here. I don't expect if you don't follow this, it's fine. It just kind of takes time to sink in. Hopefully in the next few minutes, it becomes a little bit more clear. Okay, so in the paper, then what we show is that we have a bunch of learning algorithms that we derive using this same mechanism. So you'll write this algorithm, and there are two choices that you have to make. One is what posterior approximation you choose. So you can choose it to be like Gaussian, mixture of Gaussian, Bernoulli, all sorts of other exponential families. They're mixtures. You could choose all of these different approximation. And then the second choice that you have to make is you have to kind of, for computation reason, often you will make certain choices to the natural gradient. So you will do certain, so sometimes you'll ignore the expectation, sometimes you'll make some kind of other, like reparameterization trick to compute these gradients. Based on that, you get sort of different flavor of algorithms. And so we are able to derive many types of like well-known things like gradient descent, Newton's method, ensemble methods, and SGD, RMS prop, Adam, dropout, some other fancy things that we have to compute uncertainty in deep network, and like all sorts of message passing algorithms like EM algorithm and other things that you might have heard of. So the message is kind of very consistent, and it supports the hypothesis that these algorithms all can have a similar origin. Not only that, we are also able to show that these things work well in practice. So we've been working on this for a few years. We have these 3 papers on uncertainty in deep learning, and we have a couple of algorithms. So, okay, so I was just saying that we've been working on this for a few years. So we have some of these papers, they're focusing on uncertainty in deep learning. And we've been able to show that these work quite well. And recently we won a Neuroscience challenge on approximate inference in Bayesian deep learning. You can watch this talk by Thomas Mollenhoff, who's a postdoc in the group, at this link. So just want to go a little bit more into the detail. I don't know how much time I have for that, but
MD, can I ask a simple question?
Yes, please.
So the learning rate law also comes from some Bayesian framework, or this is defined by some extra mechanism?
Yeah, so this is not, no, it doesn't come automatically right now, but that's something that needs to be. So I mean, there's some hope that because the gradient is a natural gradient, somehow the Fisher is helping you to make rho to be, close to 1, but it's not true. In practice, you have to make some trade-offs, and yeah, we have to do some more work on this. This is not yet resolved. But great question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so metacognition is left open.
Yeah,
in that sense. Any other question anybody might have? Okay, so what I wanted to do is I wanted to go a little bit more into detail to kind of convince you of the Bayesian objective. So I said, like, this is the non-Bayesian objective, and this side is the Bayesian style. And if you, I said this can be exponential family, but you can think of it as like a Gaussian. So it could be a Gaussian where, this might be a parameter of the neural network, like 1 million of those. And then you define like 1 million parameter vector for the mean. And maybe you assume it to be a diagonal covariance with like kind of where sigma being a vector of, again, 1 million. And so instead of minimizing just the loss of the neural network, you're now kind of minimizing the expected loss plus some regularization with some kind of entropy term. So you're kind of trying to find mu and sigma. And the objective looks like this. So if you choose sigma to be 0, like very close to 0, then you get your loss, which might have a lot of kind of local minima. But then you can, increase the variance. So now your distribution is becoming like not delta distribution, but it's a little bit broader. As the distribution becomes broader, some of the non-dominant local minima sort of disappear. So only dominant ones kind of remain. So this is an idea of kind of using a smoothing or some kind of regularization where you, instead of optimizing the original loss, you're optimizing a smooth loss, a different one. And this is then connected to this implicit regularization in deep learning. And also in many other, like reinforcement learning, also you use policy, which can be seen as a smoothing distribution, where you can take actions to kind of simplify your problem a bit. Okay, so with this, I want to give an example of this implicit regularization on deep learning and how Bayesian has the similar implicit regularization. For that, let's look into deriving gradient descent from Bayesian learning rules. This will also make you understand how the Bayesian learning rule is actually used in practice to derive these kind of algorithms. So gradient descent is just this algorithm. What you can do is you can choose in Bayesian learning rule a Gaussian approximation with fixed covariance. So here the M is the mean of the Gaussian, and 1 is the covariance. It's fixed to identity. It could be fixed to an arbitrary quantity. It doesn't matter. But I've, for simplicity, chosen to be identity. Then you can just do kind of standard calculation, write the natural parameter. In this case, turns out to be the mean. Write the expectation parameter. In this case, because you only have 1 degree of freedom, which is the mean, not the covariance. So you only have 1 moment, which is also the mean. So then lambda and mu, they're both mean, and the entropy is constant. So the learning rule, then you plug these quantities in there. And it's kind of straightforward because lambda is m, mu is m, it just becomes something like this, and entropy is constant, so it disappears. And so you get something very similar to gradient descent. You can see. Now the Bayesian part is kind of saying that let's not take the gradient with respect to theta, but take the gradient with respect to the mean, which goes through Q. And this is where the difference is. So if you really want it not to be Bayesian, which is what you're doing if you're a deep learning person, then you can ignore this expectation. And this is the natural gradient approximation that we call. It's a method centuries old. It's called delta method, that you throw away the whole distribution and only look at the mean. And if you did that, you would kind of get gradient descent. Right? So the step between this Bayesian and the non-Bayesian algorithm is just kind of this expectation, whether you want the gradient to go through the mean, through the distribution, or you want to directly apply the gradient on the loss, which is what this thing is doing. Okay. So now I'm going to try to explain to you that this might be the wrong thing to do. Actually, gradient descent might be the wrong thing to do. And maybe something like this expectation is the right thing to do, which is what we do in SGD. So let's look a little bit more into that to show that when you use these expectation, it actually does kind of implicit regularization. So it takes you in a flatter direction. Okay, so let's start with gradient descent. And if you do gradient descent, well, the optimum that you'll find, it's where the gradient is 0, right? So the theta star, it's 1 point. The gradient is 0. But if you did this kind of Bayesian version where you didn't take the expectation away, you kept it, then the gradient will go through this Q, right? And the fixed point of this will be this kind of, so here it's not gradient at a point going to 0. It's somehow gradient of the expectation going to 0. You can actually get more insight on this, make this more similar to the gradient descent by rewriting it slightly. So there is a theorem called Bonnet's theorem, and I'll leave the details. You can see this equation in the paper. But essentially what it tells you is that this is exactly equal to this other quantity where the gradient is computed with respect to theta, but they're computed at the samples from the distribution. So you don't want the gradient at 1 point go to 0, but you want somehow samples to be drawn from the distribution such that the gradients cancel. So it's kind of like drawing this circle of some kind of balance place where things are kind of optimum. So it's hard to kind of understand what's going on between these two. So let's dig in a little bit more. Let's look into an example where you will see that this kind of expectation of the gradient, it can be seen as some kind of noise that's been injected that is regularizing the problem. It has a similar effect to the noise in stochastic gradient descent. So stochastic gradient descent doesn't find solutions like this. It finds solutions like this. And this injection noise has a very similar property to stochastic gradients. In particular, it prefers flatter spaces. So it tries to move to places where gradients sort of cancel out. So it's a little bit of flat region. We'll try to look into this through this example. Here, I have a loss function, and this is the minimum, but the loss function is unsymmetric, meaning this side is very, very bad, and this side is slightly more flatter. Okay, so we want the robust solutions, they should kind of go this side to avoid this region. So actually, it turns out that if you did SGD on this kind of objective, so here I've drawn that, and it's some slightly real problem. So minimum is here, but this looks flatter, but it's slightly up. You just cannot see it. If you run SGD with a very small step size, so the noise injection is very small, so the expectation is sort of ignored with the very, very small steps, you recover the optimum. But if you increase the step size, so I'm showing you a Gaussian at the bottom, which is basically like these red dots taken together, and a Gaussian is formed like with the mean and the covariance from those red dots. So it's kind of just showing you how far the solution is moving from the map estimate. You could see that the iterates actually go a little bit farther to the other side because of this noise. If you increase the step size, it goes even more to that side. And if you do that farther, then you're really, really far. So somehow this noise implicitly pushes you away from the bad loss regions. You're going into the flatter direction, like that side, not this side. It's a one-dimensional problem. Okay, so just to summarize, as you increase the step size, you have a regularization effect, meaning that your solutions iterates shift towards the flatter region. If you actually do the Bayesian learning rule, so this is Bayesian learning rule where we have fixed the covariance to 1, and you see that the solution sort of has the similar effect. And this is because you are looking at, the expectation of the gradient has to go to 0. So somehow you're going to a place where the gradient cancel each other out. I don't have time, but in the paper, you can kind of see the mathematics of it, why the distribution shifts away. And it's because you have very, high gradients on this side, while low gradients on this side, because this side is flatter. So you are putting a lower mass on this side and higher mass on that side. It just kind of, this equation works that way. To balance the two gradients, you need to put the higher mass on the flatter side. So you move on that side. So actually, if you you could show that all of these step sizes that you got, so these red lines are SGD, you can choose different covariance, and that'll help you to kind of go to, flatter regions. Okay, so I've almost used 25 minutes on this. And now I'm going to quickly finish this Bayesian learning rule side, and unless there are some questions. There's a Q&A, there's a question, but there's a question. Is the star local minimum in this case? Yes, the star is the minimum, yes. It's there's only one minimum here, so it's a global minimum. Okay. Great. And you can't see it, but it's slightly up, but it looks flat, but the other places are slightly suboptimal, but it's just kind of, all solutions are very similar. So it doesn't matter which one you choose really, but a map estimate will really pick the greedy one, like the star one. And what the Bayesian solution is saying is that there are other solutions that are also good, and we should explore a little bit around these things, like what SGD would do. Okay. So the second amazing thing that we find in Bayesian learning rule, and I'll be very quick about this, is that the way that it's kind of written, somehow it's able to relate the approximation, the complexity of the approximation, to the complexity of the learning algorithm. So essentially, if you choose a very simple approximation, like a Gaussian with the mean, as we saw that we get gradient descent out of it. But if I increase the complexity and I let the covariance also to be estimated now there are 2 degrees of freedom, mean and the covariance, then the same calculation leads up to Newton method. So now the complexity is increased. If I do multiple Gaussians and I try to estimate all of them at once using some kind of mixture of Gaussian, we'll see that this will be sort of mixture of Newton, like some kind of ensemble. Different mixture components are trying to take responsibility of different regions, and then they're trying to kind of decide and collaborate among themselves of how they should distribute this load. If you continue to increase the complexity in the Bayesian learning rule, if you plug in the exact posterior, you'll get Bayes rule. So Bayesian learning rule will be equivalent to Bayes rule in the limit. Just kind of showing a little bit of more details of how Newton's method would come out of the same mechanism. It's just really the same calculation. There's no surprises here. You take the Gaussian distribution, instead of just the mean now, add covariance. Then your natural parameter and expectation parameter become larger. You have 2 degrees of freedom now, like 2 sets of parameters. So mean and the correlation. And then you try to just plug it in the equation and you just do the same thing. You just do calculation. And this is all exact. There's no approximation. In the end, you try to remove the expectation, and that gives you the Newton's method. But again, there's a choice of step size, so that's crucial, what Motoaki just asked about. And there's something that we don't know yet how to do some of those things. So here again, you will see this kind of thing that by adjusting the covariance, now you again go to a flatter solution. So like if there's a sharper minima and there's a flatter minima, and if your covariance is like broad enough, these minima will kind of disappear because of the expectation, and you'll go to the flatter region, and you get very similar equations where of optimality as what I showed you for SGD. So actually in the paper, what we showed is that this type of second order thing then is related to RMS prop and Adam. And we came up with a method that we call Wogan, which is sort of a second order modification of Adam. It's just changing a few lines in the code. But now instead of giving only one parameter, like one model, now you can estimate a distribution. So you can sort of sample this. So this is the mean, red line. And then the pink lines are the samples from Wogan on this small toy example, 2D example classification problem. But you can then apply to ImageNet. And on ImageNet, we can show that this gives us, when this was done, this was the first time that a variational inference algorithm is able to achieve the same performance as Adam and SGD, and also estimate uncertainty reasonably well. So this was, we were quite happy with this at the time. So the nice thing why it actually works quite well is because the form of this algorithm. So this is Bayesian learning rule, and this is RMS prop, and they look very similar. The modification here is like that you're perturbing the weights. So you're sampling from the Gaussian. It's like adding some noise to the weights, and then computing the gradients at those. Right. So the fixed points are slightly different. And because of that, you're able to kind of these scales in RMS prop that you compute to scale your gradients, somehow these scales also give you an estimate of uncertainty. So this is, you would expect this if you are, if you're doing this, to somehow the scale that tells you how big a jump that you can take in the space, this degree of flatness also tells you the degree of uncertainty. So it's very, very natural. And so a version of this algorithm that was done, so this was done in 2018, 2019, we had the ImageNet result. And then 2020, we had another version that simplifies some other difficulties like computing this quantity. So now the algorithm looks even more like RMS prop. And that's the method that Thomas and others from the group applied to this Neuro challenge. And that was the one that won the challenge. So things kind of come together, and they are all consistent with the hypothesis in this case. Okay, so I've used now 40 minutes. I will, if it's okay. So if you want more detail, look into the tutorial. If it's okay, can I take 10 more minutes to finish?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, awesome. So I think 10 minutes, let me just quickly go through some of the new things about robustness and adaptation. If you're doing, there's a lot of stuff here and I can't cover everything, but I'll be very brief and just tell you the crux of the things that we're doing. So as I said before, that this Bayesian learning rule is kind of giving you a mechanism to quantify what is new information and how it's added to the old belief. And the old belief sort of is encoded in the distribution through the natural parameter. So what we are trying to now understand is that if an algorithm is good, then it's expected to balance the new and old information. That means that it must know somehow what is relevant and what is irrelevant, right? So the solutions that are found by the good algorithm must also be robust to irrelevant information, because they're at a fixed point where if you throw irrelevant information at them, nothing will happen, but they'll only change if you take away important information from them. So they will suddenly, their behavior will change and they'll not be at the stable point if you take away relevant information. So somehow we can use this property to understand what is relevant and what is irrelevant. So what is new and what is old, right? And this is kind of the question that I've been fascinated with for the last 10 years. And I'm very happy that now we have, a nice fundamental principle that kind of, makes this more precise with the mathematics. So the mathematics really comes down to this very simple thing. So you have a machine like a brain, and you want to understand the machine, what is important to the machine, why does it work, how does it represent knowledge, stuff like that. What you can do is you can go inside and you can kind of stop certain places. So you can perturb certain parts of this machine, and then you can measure the sensitivity of the output to that perturbation. And this mechanisms will help you to understand what is important and what is not, right? This is kind of rooted in the notion of duality. So this dual representation helps us understand how local parts connect to the global parts. And this is how I also see this question about abstraction and confidence are kind of related, because one of them looks local, the other one looks global. And so we go on with this to kind of use Bayesian learning rule and its duality to understand this kind of information. So the mathematics is quite simple. Suppose that you have a loss function that's made up of individual losses, so individual data examples. So the individual data examples are the parts of this big machine. And in Bayesian learning rule, if I plug that in, I just get a sum over these individual, natural gradients. I can look at the fixed point of this. So the fixed point of this will be when rho equals 1, for example, right? So when this is equal to that quantity, so this is the star at the optimum. You can see that the natural parameter is made up of natural gradients. So these are kind of local natural gradients. I denote them by lambda tilde, and they somehow give you the global parameter. These are local, so they're defined with per data point, and somehow adding these data points give you the global thing. Now, the fancy thing that we figured this, and I knew about this many years ago, but I didn't put 2 and 2 together until 3-4 years ago, is that these local parameters, these local natural gradient, turns out to be Lagrange multipliers. And this is a big deal. And it's kind of trying to convince the community now why this is a big deal, is because this Lagrange multiplier tells us, how sensitive this global parameter is to the local perturbation. So the perturbation in these data example. So in the sense, if you took out this particular example from your solution, how much the solution will change is already quantified in this natural gradient. So natural gradient is actually quite essential because it's Lagrange multipliers. It tells you the sensitivity of the solution to this kind of taking away of important information. So we've been doing some work, and I will skip this actually because this is kind of hard to explain why sensitivity is important. But through this kind of sensitivity analysis, we are able to take these trained models and be able to understand what examples they find important. So maybe I'm rushing too fast, but okay. I'm realizing that maybe my mind is not right. So I've only used 35 minutes, but I'll skip that. Somebody can ask me questions and I can explain that later, keep more time for discussion. But essentially through this kind of perturbation, what we find is that so this is on some kind of CNN, on a NIST. And if you look into like the Lagrange multiplier and derive some diagnostic measures from there, you can characterize some examples as easy, and they indeed look like very regular examples, so they are always classified correctly. But you can quantify some examples that are kind of sensitive to the mean, the perturbation in the mean, and they turn out to be outliers. So like 1 and 7, you can't tell. 3 is like more mislabeled. 5 and 9. 4 is like 7 and 9, and 5 is like 3. So these are kind of mislabeled example. And it turns out they are sensitive to the perturbation in the mean. And then if you look into the perturbation in the variance, then they come out to be the unconfident, like the uncertain examples. So here, these are like, weird ones. They're somehow the network finds them very difficult to classify. And this really comes out, naturally, as we would expect, that the variance perturbation would be important for uncertain example, but the mean perturbation would be important for the ones for which the predictions are very wrong, so the residuals are high. They really come out naturally from the measure. So the measure is very, very natural. You don't have to do work to define what kind of examples you will see. They just come through the moments of the distribution. So that is the contribution here. For other data sets, you do the same thing. So like regular examples are just regular examples. So these are easy. These ones are like mislabeled, and this looks like t-shirt, but it's not really t-shirt. It's not a sandal, it's a shoe. And then uncertain examples are weird ones where you can't really tell. It's weird kind of sandal, ankle sandal, but it's not quite. So things kind of check out. Okay, so the approach that is just described now, as I said, just to summarize, that through posterior approximation, the criteria to categorize examples, they naturally emerge, right? So so in the paper, we are also kind of showing, this paper is not out yet, and I'm sorry about that. But essentially what we see there is that if you choose different distributions, all these different concepts like support vector machines, influence function, inducing inputs, these are used in very different fields, but they all arise through the use of distribution and through the use of this general Bayesian principle. So you don't have to work hard to define these measures. They just kind of pop out if you pick the right kind of approximation. And then the nice thing is that these local parameters, these Lagrange multipliers, they are available for free. So you can just compute this kind of natural variant, and because you can extract them from Adam-like algorithm, as I said before, you can just run Adam or SGD, and then you can just kind of look at the output, and that gives you, essentially the representation. So you can apply it to anything, any kind of loss, any kind of problem, unsupervised, supervised, it doesn't really matter. The main point is that the sensitivity of the posterior, it leads to this kind of Bayes duality. So this is a new concept that we are trying to describe. It goes beyond the usual notions of duality and dual representations, such as those used in SVM and kernel methods. So we have a big project, which is called Bayes Duality Project. And the goal here is really towards doing this kind of lifelong learning AI. And we've, over the years, we've got around $3 million US through very generous government funding agencies. So we're very thankful for that. And this is what we are working towards now. So the thing that some of work that we've done, adaptation, continual learning, I thought I will end the talk by just briefly describing this. So now that I talk about robustness, let's think about like how to also adapt to new information. So when the world is continuously evolving. How can we kind of preserve some past knowledge, but also learn some new? And now we're going to use this idea of memorable examples. So these important examples that we figured out through this dual representation, this Lagrange multiplier, we're going to use that. Just to showcase how it actually, we do it in practice, is that suppose, you're given some data, let's say binary classification, you learn a classifier, and what we're going to do is we essentially kind of look into what the classifier finds important. So we're going to have a representation. This usually in these kind of problem, it comes out to be some boundary, examples that are somehow characterizing this this decision boundary. And then when we get the next set of examples, so maybe the world has changed and you get some new data, new experiences, then you retrain your model such that you don't forget these representations, so these big circles that you have here. And then you repeat the process. You find the representation again, you see the new task, and then you kind of, repeat the training such that the line classifies the current data, but it also classifies all the past representations that you have found. So of course, the memory is growing in this case. We haven't yet kind of done the making the abstractions of all of these past data examples, and that is something that we are working on right now. Okay, so a little bit more details on the math. Is actually quite straightforward. So like we just do this kind of Bayesian objective. You have the entropy regularization, but now the new data and past data is sort of like split. So new data comes through the new loss function, but the past data comes through some kind of regularizer. So you use the entropy of the past distribution. And previous approaches were just kind of naively applying this. So just take the Gaussian approximation. In this paper, people might know that kind of restarted the work on continual learning and also Bayesian version of it. They will just kind of take this, and this will give you some kind of quadratic regularizer because these are Gaussian approximation. But what we are actually saying is that we shouldn't be doing something straightforward like that, but we should try to look into the representation. So we go to the dual of this, and the mathematics looks complicated, but essentially we are kind of going from the parameter space to the function space. And so it turns out that when you write the dual problem, in this case, it is a Gaussian process because it's kind of Gaussian approximation is like a linear model for a learned network. This is all kind of explained in this paper 3 and 4. And then this linear model, when you look into the dual space, it becomes a Gaussian process. And then in the Gaussian process, you say, I'm going to choose some memorable examples and basically define the process through those memorable examples instead of using the whole, past data. So in the end, it comes out to be very, very simple quantity, this thing. It's kind of saying that I want to maintain the prediction error. So like in binary classification, this will be sigmoid of at some memorable function. So like these are some of the old places that you picked with those big circles. And you want to make sure that your current network predicts well at those memorable examples. And it's just kind of quadratic in that. And then you are going to weight with some kind of kernels. So more important examples are given higher weights. So it's very intuitive that a Bayesian approach like this kind of gives you something very, very natural to avoid catastrophic forgetting. So it's not the end of the story. It's actually really, really beautiful. And I'll finish now. This is almost the last slide. And it turns out that if you actually look into these dual parameterization, here we did it with neural network, we got it at Gaussian process, and we found this using the Bayesian learning rule. So it's just kind of taking the natural gradient, converting them into the dual space, and then kind of looking into the important Lagrange multiplier that gives you the highest things, and then using them. But what we also did recently is that we are able to show that this kind of regularization in the function space using the dual representation, it turns out that it's kind of a prior, which is what you would expect, that it's somehow summarizing past knowledge through these memorable experiences in this function space. And it's beautiful in the sense that you could show that it reconstructs the gradient of the past. So actually you're running a gradient-based method. So whenever you write these regularizers, they're essentially trying to mimic the gradient that you would have if you actually used all the past data. But now they're somehow being clever about it, and they're not using all the data, but they're using some representation of it. And that representation is the dual representation. So the math is kind of really beautiful. In the paper, we also show that all sorts of like SVM and in GPs or knowledge distillation in neural network, all of these methods are actually using the same mechanism. So they're all sort of a K prior, a knowledge adaptation prior. That's what we call it. It is essentially the functional regularization step that I showed in the previous step using the GP. It's kind of the same thing. So we see a very strong evidence that good adaptive algorithms sort of use this kind of prior information that's in the dual space. And well, I don't have time to show this, but you could show that this, if in simple examples, like if you increase the number of memorable example, the gradient sort of approximated better and better, and you get the minimum, you very close, arbitrarily close to the minimum if you increase the number of memorable example. So now the open problem here is to find a meaningful, abstraction or representation, and we have some work on it already. But I'm happy to discuss some of those with you later. Okay, so to summarize, and I used 47 minutes now from my clock. So I showed you a new perspective of Bayes, which is essential for adaptive and robust deep learning. I try to convince you that this Bayesian perspective that goes through approximation of the posterior is essential, because somehow the approximation to the posterior is an approximation of the model. So it's some kind of representation of the model. So it's really going toward this style of world model abstraction that we talk about in memory. All of these things are kind of gone through the same quantity, and I show you several instances of these where the same message kind of appears again and again. So our hope is really for the next 5 years, we're working on Bayes duality principles to design AI that can use these ideas, but these fundamental principles to make more human-like AI systems. And I'm happy to answer questions now, and this is the group.
Okay, so thank you, MD, for your wonderful talk. And at first, you have a question in the QA box.
Yes, so from Hataya-san, there's a question. Thank you for an interesting talk. Is it possible to create a robust method that does not ignore minority and rare class? Yes, I think that's a very important question. So I actually truly believe that representation is a key question that we must be thinking about, because, this is what I show here. This is a trained model, and a trained model without paying attention to what it should pay, you should really learn. This is kind of this IID world where all the data is thrown at it at random, and has somehow figured out that some examples are easy for it, some examples are outliers for it. It doesn't mean that its reality of the world matches with the reality of the world. So if you had an imbalance in your data set, the machine's view of the reality will be completely screwed up. So I think once you start to understand these representation, you can try to correct them by seeing where the gaps in the knowledge of the model are, and that's a whole new thing to work on. So I really hope to collaborate with people on this in the future to work on privacy, fairness, and interpretation. And I think there's a huge, the tools here should be useful for that.
Actually, the Tanabe sensei is.
May I speak?
Please.
Let me tell you, great talk. I
Thank
like
you.
this Bayesian method very much. My
Thank-
question is, you have two functions, entropy and prior. Do they compete each other? I feel you don't need entropy part regularization. Am I right?
Well, yeah, you sorry, the way that I present this is a little bit misleading, so I apologize for that. You actually, I think it's just maybe I wrote in a way that's hard to see. So you could see that the loss, I didn't define the loss properly here, and I'm sorry about that. But the loss is kind of containing a prior. So loss may have many terms in it, and so it has lots of data example, plus a prior, and then the posterior. So you essentially you can take the prior out and put it here, and it will become a tail divergence between the posterior and the prior.
I see.
So you're exactly right. Yeah.
This is a part of Q. I see. Okay.
Exactly. So Q must be similar to the prior, but it should also be close to the data. And then that's the trade-off.
This expression is rather misleading. You don't need it to persuade other people to understand it.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess so, yes. I started writing this way because it was easier for neural network people to understand. So,
I see. I like a natural gradient method. Actually, I proposed some method, Newton method, for solving the.
Yes. So it's pretty much.
I have some paper on the penalized logistic regression machine, which utilize the Hessian metrics. I mean, anyway, my question, another question is that you see in the deep learning community, they have been using half precision computation. I'm interested in the computational aspect of this method. Many people in the learning machine, deep learning people, actually did the regularization by stopping the iterative algorithm, and yes. I don't like it very much.
Yes.
You should put down the whole. I mean, you should make a model, proper model, proper stochastic model. You see.
Exactly.
Deep learning lacks this modeling aspect. I don't like it, but your method is very nice. But you say computationally, you must do the computation very carefully. You don't stop. I mean, you don't do early stopping.
No. Yeah. So yeah. This is great. Yeah. So I completely agree with you. So here, at least the hope is that you don't have to do that.
This is a typical one. This is not good boundary, I feel.
Yes. So I mean, I would not say
even that one is not good.
Yeah, I mean, this is not so one property that these methods have, that if you let them run forever, they will not kind of like become overconfident, meaning that, you know, if you run the neural network, then the prediction like this that is produced from softmax, they will go to either 1 or 0. Yeah. They're like really, they will shrink, and there's no way that you can stop them from shrinking. So yeah, what actually these methods do that they don't really shrink to 0 or 1. And the thing is that they will kind of keep jumping, you know, so in SGD, if you're jumping here and there, then that's not good. But here jumping is good because that's the optimum. The optimum is like a distribution where you keep moving around. So you don't have to like early stop the method, at least theoretically. Again, like I don't have a paper where I really say that you'll never have to do it. But I expect, and at least from some of the experiments that we do have better properties. But I would not claim that we solved the problem that they have, you know. Yeah.
I see. I'm a Bayesian statistician. So I like the informative prior rather than the simpler one.
Yes.
See, you used in your talk, you talked about the Gaussian prior.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But you say, I feel there are a lot of use for non-Gaussian prior, I mean, more informative prior.
Yes.
So in that case, how does your scheme paradigm apply to this?
Yes, it's yeah. So that's a great point. It's really trying to like use the old posterior as the new prior,
right?
To say informative in this, for example, continual learning setting, it makes sense.
Right.
And of course, it's sorry, and so this is not like informative in the Bayesian, you know, statistics sense. This is not done properly. So it's more kind of trying to understand if continual learning can be, the knowledge can be transferred from the old task to a new task. And so you use a prior, and people have usually just been using a Gaussian prior. So this is like a Gaussian, but we try to say that this is too simplistic because you don't understand what information is inside that Gaussian, you know, in that neural network that you learned before. So going into this dual space is really this idea of going into sort of forming, a Gaussian process or a kernel where information is represented more explicitly. So you could pick things that are more informative than the other, and then you try to define the informativeness through this duality of how much the solution would be sensitive. So I believe that this is kind of goes into defining what is informative in a prior. It is not really finished, you know, solving the question the Bayesian statistician would like to solve, but it's doing one version of that for this kind of problem where you don't really care about the prior to really spread its mass properly, but still represent the knowledge in some way so that some end task is done, like here, forgetting is avoided, you know.
Okay.
I'm sorry if this is not a satisfactory answer, but the work is, we're just starting.
And then may I ask another question?
Please.
When your regular function has a very sharp, narrow well, what would happen? Do you have some computational difficulty?
Yeah, I think, of course, if you have a very, very sharp minima, you
sometimes the problem is very ill-conditioned. You see, many people don't face up with the ill conditioning of the regular function for the very difficult problem. So I feel this. I feel you must address this kind of ill conditioning of the problem.
Yeah, again, I don't know how to, the deep learning people would say that we can solve these problems through implicit regularization. But, exactly as you said, if there's a minima and there's a direction that's super flat and the other one is super, there's a wall, I mean, you may be driven to, really, really far away place. And so again, there has to be a prior that somehow helps you to, make this shape a little bit better, but they don't do it right now and things work out. I don't know how long it's going to work out. So, sorry,
anyway, very good, very great talk. I should learn a lot from your paper.
Thank you very much. Very nice to hear you.
Cortese-san, could you speak?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry.
So Emtiyaz, thank you so much for this great talk. Of course, I do not fully understand mathematics, but I'd like to ask several questions from the computational neuroscience point of view. So I got very much interested in Bayesian learning rule with multiple mixtures of Gaussian, something like that. And you said that you could have with some kind of Newton-like algorithm with these multiple distributions. So you should be familiar with very old algorithm called the mixture of experts by Jacobs, Jordan, and Hinton in 1990. And I've been utilizing this algorithm for robotics control. And recently with Aurelio, we could successfully apply this to explain several behaviors, reinforcement learning behaviors of humans. So is there any connection if you have large model optimization and if you use Bayesian learning rule, you could systematically reproduce mixture of experts learning rule, because this old algorithm was somehow invented ad hoc and is not well classified in the species of algorithms, I believe. So do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very, very optimistic about it. So, I mean, I cannot claim that, so this was kind of, this was written very recently, the mixture of Gaussian. So first part, is it principled a way to do mixture of experts? So my answer is yes, because if you actually go inside the algorithm and you look at how these distributions are set, so the distribution queue, it turns out that you essentially get mixtures and then you get a responsibility function that sort of assigns you to different, it tells you which minima is sort of more important for you. So in a situation like, so for example, here, in this example, I hope you can see the screen, there are two minima here. And if you fit a mixture of Gaussian here, then one will be like very peaky and the other one will be very flat. And the responsibility function will be assigned to these appropriately, so that you will, and it's the mathematics is actually quite straightforward. So it's just this equation. It's just saying that the gradients should always kind of settle down to 0. So the samples that you'll generate, somehow they will cancel to 0 times the responsibility plus cancel to 0 at this local minimum times their responsibility. And it's all goes through the same equation. So it's very principled.
I see. Okay,
now, great. Showing that it works in practice is something that Thomas and others are doing now. So they're writing a paper. So they, in the winning competition, they did use mixture, but they didn't learn the mixture weights. So we cannot yet claim if the real Bayesian thing has actually happened. but they're actually writing a paper on this. So hopefully there'll be some sign of this. So.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'd love to learn that if it's published. So I have one more quite general question. So I'm a neuroscientist and you are a mathematician or machine learning researcher. So how you can interpret all these wonderful algorithms of Bayesian learning rule or forgettable memories which should not be forgotten, or duality of the algorithm onto brain structures or non-brain functions. I think you always have some intuition from neuroscience and how humans can easily and quickly learn new skills. You show one of your talks at Deriving AIP, you showed us your daughter somehow playing with the guitar and made music from that. So can you tell your intuition about this? Because as you know, I am one of the advisors of Deriving AIP, and the basic group has been doing very well. But you need to somehow advertise this to more general group of audience, more general group of people. And I think connection to neuroscience is one of the good way to, sell your ideas to more broad population. Sorry for this very, big and conceptual question.
No, this of course, I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you about this. But this is one of the hope that we have, is to kind of reach broader audience and to make people understand that these mathematical concepts are, they're not kind of something that we made up, that they are, they are present in like natural algorithms or artificial algorithms that we see around. So so far we have only looking at artificial algorithms, as you see, and I do believe. So I think that the way that we are defining the fundamental principle that I say Bayes duality, maybe it sounds like a fancy name, but it's really about kind of knowing what is relevant and what is irrelevant. So going back to that video of my daughter that, I think I showed to you maybe 5 years ago, even 6 years ago, right? So there, the question was always like, how, when she's playing ukulele, being something around, she's somehow figuring out that this sound is the thing that she should focus on. And so she figures out the relevant versus irrelevant. And of course, in the brain, the mechanism will favor certain information in the world that are naturally, this kind of a curriculum that's been built for us, that we will look at certain things more than the other things. And so I think the principle here is really of stability, of robustness or adaptivity, that there has to be, when learning, of course, the stability will be broken at times, but then you will again seek for stability, or you could call it free energy principle. And I think neuroscience people many times don't like that when I say these things, but there are different ways to say this, but this kind of, how do you define these stable points? And I think that if you were to design an experiment, with subjects to check if we take them from one experiment to another, so you learn something, and then you try to change that learning to something else, you can characterize those examples beforehand, by looking at their algorithm that runs on their head, and by fitting a Bayesian, thing to that, and looking at Lagrange multiplier. And I'm very confident about this. But we need to think about how we can do that. So I'll be totally up to doing something like that.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think sometimes, neuroscience group within Deakin or neuroscience group in Japan will collaborate with you to directly examine, some of the predictions drawn from these algorithms on humans or in animals. So thank you so much for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.